Hello and welcome to Podcast 101, a workshop to give you some tips on how to develop your own podcast. A little bit by way of background as to who I am and my experience. I've been a pastor and a professor for almost 50 years. Retirement, I prefer to call um, the third act. And my third act, one of the elements of that third act is podcasting. Um, but during my active ministry years, I served on campuses, uh, in seminary classes, on a college campus, in parishes. And if there was a common ingredient in all of that, it was I worked with young people. And that was a great blessing. And so now in this third act, I am writing, I am kayaking, I am grandparenting, adventuring, and podcasting. So let's get right to it. First of all, when you think of doing a podcast, I think you need to think about what is the message. And I think there are three ingredients in determining the message. Number one, what are you enthused about? That word entheos means in God. So for those of us in ministry, what are you enthused about? What excites you and what are you passionate about? Secondly, what do you know something about? What is your experience? So work with what you're excited about and what you know something about. And then thirdly, what will benefit others? How can you, through this podcast, help others in one way or another? The second thing to consider is who is the audience? I found that I obviously started with my friends. I started with my church community. I started with people I knew. But in many ways, my target audience was younger people, my own young adult children. I have five adult children, and they are podcast junkies. That's their description of themselves. And so I thought, well, this would be a great way to reach my own kids and that whole generation that is very excited about podcasting, whether they're in a car or whether they're going for a hike, a way to keep learning through a podcast. Next, where do I begin? For me, I had to first find a platform, and the platform that broadcasts my podcast is called Anchor, Anchor. I chose it for several reasons, mainly because it's free and it's very simple to operate. So, check on the internet, but I found Anchor to be very good because it also allows you to send your podcast to the primary locations where people do listen to podcasts like Spotify and iTunes, etc. Next, what kind of equipment will you need? Well, I'm wearing my headset. I learned that simple headset, maybe $50, $60, works very, very well. I can hear my own voice. I know my sound level, and the quality of my audio is good. So I think you can be very inexpensive and very simple equipment wise. Obviously, a computer. I have a laptop, but you can do it on a phone. You can do it on a tablet. But find the simple equipment and start from there. Next, be aware of getting good sound. Part of it is having this microphone that I'm speaking into, but also be aware that you can get reverberation in a room that has walls that sound will bounce off. I'm in my office here. You can't see it here, but I have positioned and hung tapestries and towels and blankets and things to make sure that the sound is not bouncing around. It's absorbed by those and then comes directly to you. Be aware of ambient sounds or natural sounds. Choose a place and a time where you're not going to get trains going by or planes landing during or in my case, my grandkids are here several days a week. And so I don't podcast on those days. Look forward to their interruptions, but you don't want to have those interruptions. So a sign on your door and a quiet place uh, will get you the good sound you're looking for. A word about writing. I tend to be a writer, and I like to write out my podcast in advance. And since it's audio, you can work with that script, if you will. You can polish it, you can practice it, you can, hone it to a pretty precise instrument. You also know when you have a script how long it will be. If you're ad-libbing, sometimes you get carried away. But having a script will tell you how long the actual podcast is. In the actual platform, the Anchor platform, they encourage you to develop an intro and an outro, just as they sound, a short introduction that says what this podcast is and who you are, and then the podcast is shared. And then at the end is the outro, which oftentimes will be thanking people for listening, mentioning what the next podcast is in the future. And you can promote and send them to your website or to other places and other things that you want to let people know about. The most important thing, really, in terms of podcasting is practicing. You probably have all heard the story about the man who was lost in New York City, and he was wandering around, and he finally found a New Yorker, and he says, "How do I get to Carnegie Hall?" And the New Yorker kind of chuckled and said, "Well, practice." And so practice, practice, practice is crucial. Make your mistakes, although you can make mistakes in your recording on the platform, and you can edit those because the editing function is rather simple. But if you practice, you'll feel more comfortable, and your confidence will show through. Next, how do you build an audience? By all means necessary. Think again of family, think of friends, think of your church, think of the people that know you already and would be interested in your podcast. Use social media, use newsletters, word of mouth, use all of those means to help folks know about your podcast. And over time, the podcast will grow in terms of its quality and also in terms of the scope and its audience. I mentioned length. When you have a script, you can sort of determine how long it's going to be. And I decided early on when I did a solo podcast, in other words, when it was just me sharing, I picked 15 minutes as a good window to speak into and to share. When I do interviews or conversations, I've done a couple of series like that. I expand them often to a half an hour. So that allows for more interaction between me and the person who I'm speaking with. So determine your length. And again, you can change it up, but that will be an important determination. Be aware too, as you're promoting and building your audience, of the best times of day, best places. One of the places that I found that I really promote probably my podcast more than any other is on Facebook, and certainly Instagram and Twitter. All the various means are good tools. I did some research and found out that there are certain days that are good and not so good on Facebook and on Instagram. For Facebook, the weekends actually are not good times. Tuesday through Thursday are the best times. And so what I have decided is I do a teaser on Tuesday and a post of the full episode on Thursday. And that's worked very, very well for me. When you post on Facebook, you will want to have some kind of picture, which obviously will draw people into the subject matter. You'll also be developing in the platform a logo or some kind of artwork that will be your way to let people know that your podcast is coming up. Post on multiple pages. I post all over the place. And of course, those of us in the Lutheran Church, have lots of pages. I post on the ELCA website, the network website, the outdoor ministry website, the Christian Ed website, etc. So post in as many places as possible. A word about evaluation. One of the great things about the platform I use, the Anchor platform, is there is a section on analytics. And so you can check and see, number one, how many people have listened to your podcast, if they're male or female, non-binary, if their ages are 50 or 60 or younger, where they listen, different parts of the world. So in other words, you can find out a good bit of information that way. I found out early on, given the fact that I'm older, most of my audience was older. So I then targeted younger people, partially in terms of the content and partially in terms of the promotion, to make sure that I was broadening my audience. I think that pretty much covers the main points in starting a podcast. We'll have some time after a couple of examples to do questions and answers. The first example I'm going to share is a short, very short, 2 or 3 minute audio podcast, which is kind of a favorite of mine because it shows the sound, a story, a good story, which is important in podcasting. And it has, I laid some music in terms of the background. And again, that's available on the platform. The second is a video teaser from an interview I did with epidemiologist Dr. Michael Osterholm. The teaser is shown on Tuesday. And as I said, the podcast is shown on Thursday. So here are 2 examples to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what I've done with my podcast. And if you want to check it out in more detail, the name of the podcast is Say What? A Fresh Look at Old Sayings, the podcast which explores the origins, meaning, and value of old sayings, familiar expressions, and adages. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to your questions and answers after you have these samples. All the best in your podcasting. Say What? A Fresh Look at Old Sayings. One summer, I took a group of my students to France to visit the Taizé community, where young people from all over the world had gathered to sing and pray and explore their vocations. One afternoon, I went for a walk with Jacques, one of the brothers. On top of a hill, we stopped to rest on an ancient stone wall. We looked out over the picturesque countryside, dotted with farms and trees and fences, and he asked me, "Do you know why this area is so beautiful?" I said, "It's so peaceful." He then said something I will never forget. This countryside is so beautiful because people have lived here for centuries and they have listened to the earth. Everything is in its place for a reason. Houses face the south for the sun. The stones were removed from the fields, creating pastures lined with fences. Trees were planted for windbreaks and to shelter from the sun. It is beautiful because for centuries, people have listened to the earth. Merci, Frère Jacques. Stay tuned in the coming weeks for a series of episodes entitled Life Journeys, when I will be interviewing and exploring what inspires and motivates artists, educators, musicians, poets, scientists, politicians, and theologians. Be sure to subscribe so you will receive news of when Life Journeys will begin. It's a beautiful fall day, and as I head out on my journey today, I ponder and I pause and I think about the podcast series I'm just completing on life journeys, coming up with a conversation with Dr. Michael Osterholm, the world-famous epidemiologist who will be sharing his sense of hope in a time of pandemic.
I think if there's ever a story to be told, it's how the goodness, how the light of the world can do in the darkness and the harm and the pain. And I think that's what we have to keep remembering. So I think that from that standpoint, if there was ever a time to have a pandemic of kindness, a pandemic of reaching out to others, to caring about others, now is the time, more than I've ever known in my entire career. The second piece of it is really about protecting yourself, is really not about social distancing. I'm trying to get rid of that word. In fact, I would like to declare it out of bounds. It's physical distancing, never socially distanced. Right now, we need closeness more than ever. And we have to find the creative ways to deal with the mental health issues, the despair, the loneliness, the kinds of feelings that so many people today are experiencing because of this. People who are older, who have underlying health conditions, who are fearful every day for their lives because they know that if they contract this virus infection, it could be a fatal case.
That line that stands out in my mind is we need now in this fall season, a pandemic of kindness. Thank you. Michael Osterholm.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for your vocation, Luther's notion of your calling in the world of science that began at a very early age in Northeast Iowa and serves not only the United States, but I think serves the world in wonderful ways.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
All right. And soon, a new series will begin called Straight from the Heart. And I'll be thinking about and reflecting on the heart as a symbol of what grounds us, what's at the heart of the matter in our music and in our relationships, learning by heart, broken hearts, exercising our hearts, and ultimately the great commandment, loving God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and our neighbors as ourselves. I hope you join me as I launch the new series, and you'll share with your friends and subscribe, and join me on my podcast, Say What? A fresh look at old sayings. And thanks for listening.